Hello and welcome, everyone. Um, I'm just getting everything set up. Let me know if you have any technical questions, and we're just going to wait. We'll probably get started really, really shortly after 5:30. Hopefully, most folks will be able to sign on. All right, well, if there are no technical difficulties, I'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Elizabeth B. Ayer, and I'm the Director of Programs currently at Growing Hope. I am actually leaving Growing Hope at the end of the week. I'm finishing up my time with the organization, but I will be continuing these classes. So this is the second in a 4-class series. The following 2 Wednesdays will also have classes. And then if it seems like people want to talk more, we can always schedule some later. I will say I have an active dog in the background, so if you hear some noises, that's probably why. But hopefully she'll be good during this time. I am going to start to share my screen, which has the presentation, and I'll talk a little bit about what we'll be talking about tonight. All right. Is anyone having trouble seeing my screen? It should say Gardening 101 at the top with a picture of some folks right underneath in front of a Growing Hope mural. And then there is the Growing Hope, our logo, on the right-hand side. If anyone is having any troubles, please, feel free to unmute yourself or post in the chat box. I will let you know that during the screen share, it's a little bit harder for me to see the participants. And so please do use that chat feature if you're having any trouble or you have any questions for me. So welcome, really excited to get to spend the next about hour and a half with you tonight talking about gardening. This is our second in a 4-series class. And I'm really excited that we're able to do this. Of course, with the pandemic still in effect, we are doing some programming in person on the farm, but we are also leaning more into our virtual programming. This is the first time that I've done this class over Zoom, and so far seems like pretty good. So we may continue to do it into the future. I'll just start with a little bit about, actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to go over the agenda. So the agenda for tonight, welcome, that is what I'm doing right now. I'll do a land acknowledgement, introduce myself, and love to hear from you guys. We have a smaller group tonight. It looks like we have about 12 participants. We may have others join us. Then I'm going to do just a very quick review from our first class for folks that were or not there. And then we're going to talk about compost, one of my favorite topics. So we'll talk about compost. We'll see how folks are feeling. We may take a short break. Then we're going to talk about seasonality and how to create your garden calendar. And then we'll talk about a couple different intensive growing techniques that I like to share for folks who are really trying to grow the most amount of food possible. And then we'll leave time for question and answers at the end. So that's the plan for today. And I will just get us started with a land acknowledgement. I always like to take a minute at the beginning of all of our events on the farm and also virtually to acknowledge the land that I am on and the land that we are cultivating and growing on at Growing Hope. I want to acknowledge that this land was forcibly taken from the people of the Three Fires, the Anishinaabe people, which includes the Potawatomi, the Odawa, and the Ojibwe. I want to honor the many, many years that they cared for and managed and lived on this land. This area was a giant farm all the way out to the Great Plains. It was a heavily managed area, and for many, many years, the Anishinaabe people developed agricultural technology, agricultural practices, spiritual practices to live with the land in a sustainable way, both for the land itself and for themselves. I want to also reject the myth that prior to European colonization, this land was vacant. It was not vacant. It was loved and cared for. And I hope that in the near future, we are all able to continue to honor and acknowledge the people of the Three Fires and this land, this unceded land. And I would like to also see for all of us to support a truth and reconciliation process that includes the return of land and land use management to the people of the Three Fires. Let's get this. Here I have a picture of some of the amazing water protectors. This is from the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. Here in Michigan, we have a great resource, and with that, great responsibility in being close to the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes hold over 20% of the world's surface fresh water. It is water that we will be dependent on for future generations. It is water that we are dependent on now. And it is water that is under attack by private corporations looking to make profit without caring about the long-term harm caused to the earth and to people, including the pipelines, the extraction of water by Nestle, the use of water for manufacturing, the discharge of dirty water, of warm water, of polluted water into our lakes. And I want to ask all of you to just pause and think for a second about what you can do to give back to the indigenous people whose land you are occupying. Thank you. I also want to pose two questions to the group. How can we care for this land, knowing that this land does not belong to us, knowing that this land belongs to the future generations, knowing that what we do on the land, our consumer choices, our political choices, the way that we live our lives, and the way that we allow the current political system to operate greatly affects the land. And what does it mean for us to have both a respectful and a reciprocal relationship with the land? Because we are dependent on the land. The land provides all of our nourishment. And what do we do to give back to the land? Excuse me, I'm just going back and forth a little bit. So I'd like to ask for folks to put in the chat box what it means to you to be in a respectful relationship with the land, perhaps the land where you live, or where you are staying, or where you are currently. What do you do to center yourself, to protect the land, to protect future generations? What does it mean to be in reciprocal relationship with the land? What does it mean to be in relationship with the land, knowing that we all are already? It may not be intentional, but it is very true. If anyone has anything they would like to share, please do go ahead and put it in the chat. For me, when I think about my relationship with the land, It includes how I care for the land where I live, how I utilize all of the resources and the nutrients that are in the land so I can produce food for myself, my family, and my community. And how can I share my knowledge of the land with others and try to change the food system to be sustainable, to include caring for the land, to open up and show people how our current food system was created, the policies that were put in place, and the values behind those policies, and to think about what do we want to have in our food system? Do we want a food system that is only based on allowing a small number of people to profit? Or do we want a food system that will nurture the land so that it will nurture us? Thank you. A few people put things in the chat box. Not adding poisonous chemicals to the soil. Yes, thank you, especially in Southeast Michigan. You know, many of us who are in Washtenaw County, we have the dioxin plume coming close to poison our water. And of course, we have the PFAS that has been put in the water by the military and by private corporations. I'm sorry, my dog is barking in the background. Whoops. I also saw reparations. Thank you. The redistribution of wealth and resources is necessary for the continued health of all of us. And ensure that other species also get food. Yes, thank you. Other species are also important and have rights. I will continue to talk about what it means to be in relationship with the land throughout this class and over the next few sessions. And I really thank you guys for putting things in the chat. It's very inspirational to see that folks are thinking about this. We really are at a critical moment in time of our civilization where the climate crisis is upon us. It is greatly affecting our agriculture. It is greatly affecting ourselves and our families. Of course, right now we're in the midst of the pandemic, as well as a new civil rights movement. So these are difficult times, and I find growing and connecting to the soil myself to be extremely replenishing. It's what gives me hope for the future, gives me purpose in life, and I'm excited to share more of that with you guys tonight. I will just talk a little bit about Growing Hope for those of you who are newer, who weren't with us last week. The mission of Growing Hope is to foster an equitable and sustainable local food system where all people are empowered to grow, sell, buy, prepare, and eat nourishing food. That is a description of an economy, of an economic system, the actors, and some of the acts in this system. And at Growing Hope, we want that system to be sustainable for the earth, sustainable for the people involved, and for all people to have full access to food, full access to decision-making power, full access to knowledge about how our food system works. And we want to encourage as many people as possible to be fully involved in the food system, because it is really up to all of us to really look at what our current food system is and what it's doing, and think about and dream how a better system could be, and start creating that system today. And a really wonderful thing about gardening is that through our gardening practices, we are creating that world. We are not waiting for someone else to create it. Every day we are out there and we are creating that world right now. So a little bit about Growing Hope. We have 4 main areas of work. We have our farm and garden programs. We do have a 1 1/4 acre urban farm pretty close to downtown Ypsilanti over on West Michigan Avenue, where we demonstrate different types of growing practices, hold educational workshops. We hold summer programs, field trips, after school programs. We grow quite a bit amount of food and flowers, which we use in our programs. We provide to our program participants. We donate to the community, and we also sell some of it at our markets. We also have our youth and school programs, including the field trips on the farm, a teen leadership program. We have about 15 teens who partake in a 20-hour-a-week summer program where they get paid to learn leadership skills, to learn about the food system, and to really get their hands in the soil and do some growing. We also have the farmers markets. We run the Saturday Depot Town Farmers Market and the Tuesday Downtown Farmers Market. We also launched the online farmers market this year with COVID. It is still going on. You can sign on and through the website order from all different farmers from across the area. And we pack it for you, and you pull up and we put it right in your trunk. So it's a no contact pickup. And one note about what's really great right now with our farmers markets is we have unlimited double up bucks, which means if you are using SNAP or food stamps, also called EBT, you will get the same amount that you spent on produce in coupons that you can then use. So it basically doubles your grocery budget. And that is accepted at the online market. We also have our food entrepreneurship programs. We have a brand new renovated kitchen, incubator kitchen right downtown. And we actually did the ribbon cutting ceremony just this week. It's really a wonderful kitchen. It is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to folks for affordable rental to use to grow their food business. So that's a little bit about Growing Hope. And we will go ahead and get started with a little bit of review from last week. But before we do that, I want to pause and see if anyone has any questions or comments to share. Feel free to unmute yourself. All right, well, if no one has any questions or comments, we'll move right along. So I just wanted to start with a quick review from last week. Last week we talked about soil. We talked about the different parts of the soil, the mineral content, the water, the oxygen space, and the organic matter, and how all of those things are necessary to have a healthy soil to grow our food in. We talked about soil health and how to do some soil testing if you have any concerns about heavy metals in your soil. We talked about pH and how you want to have a neutral pH so that your plants can access the most amount of nutrients from the soil. And I just always want to call it out that it is the bacteria and the fungus in the soil that allows plants to absorb nutrients. And it is those bacteria and fungus that are so essential. Oftentimes people think of bacteria and fungus as negative things, as things we want to destroy or kill. However, if we were to kill all the bacteria and fungus in the soil, our vegetable plants would all shrivel and die. We need those bacteria, we need that fungus. It is part of the soil food web. And so just to note that bacteria and fungus are amazing, wonderful things, even though there is also a lot of talk about fear of bacteria and funguses. Excuse me. All right, so the living soil is amazing. I love it. I hope you all love it. I take every chance I can to get my hands in the soil. I have been working with Growing Hope, like I said, for about 4 years, but I have been growing and teaching organic production over a couple decades, both in Michigan, also in New York, where I worked in the city, and I also worked in rural farms. And no matter where I am, no matter where I am growing, the most important thing is always the soil. The soil, the soil, the soil. The soil is where our nutrients come from. It's where our plants live. Without it, we can't eat, except for, of course, there's now hydroponic and aquaponic systems for growing food. Most notably, hydroponic relies on synthetic and extracted nutrients from all around the world to grow food in what is basically a nutrient solution. It's not very sustainable. And of course, in Michigan, where we have lots of wonderful land and water, we don't need to go down that path, especially because currently the source of our electricity is very unsustainable. We don't want to do anything that would promote more fracking. And so using lights and electricity and things like that to grow food is not really a sustainable option for us here in Michigan. Of course, unless you're in an area where there's no clean soil or it's toxic. Does someone have a question? Okay. So here's just a picture of some of the amazing things that are part of the soil food web. Soil, it is a living ecosystem. It's not an inert object. Basically, the point of this. It has lots of nutrients and has lots of little creepy crawler things in it. So I wanted to move on from our review of last week to talk about compost. So compost is a natural process of the decomposition of organic matter. And when I say organic matter, I mean things that are carbon-based. So in the woods, you see compost happening, you see the decomposition. When a tree falls, it will slowly decompose back into the soil with the help of biological and chemical processes. And compost is the finished compost product. It is a dark black or brown product. It smells fresh, like the soil. It is full of amazing, stable carbon that holds on to nutrients. And it is basically like adding vitamins to your soil. So compost is a great addition to any garden soil. We start our garden beds at Growing Hope with about a 50-50 mix. So it's about half compost and half topsoil. Those are in the new gardens that we create. And then on our own site, we use compost as our main source of fertility, adding it to the beds more as a spice than the main content of the soil. And I think that any home gardeners that can compost should. It is a great way to avoid putting more things into the landfill. It prevents both taking of land and putting it into unusable industries. It decreases the amount of greenhouse gases released into the air. And of course, it actually provides nutrients to your garden. So compost is a great thing to do at home. You can use food scraps from your own kitchen. You can use any organic stuff from around your yard. You can even bring in things. So I want to just talk a little bit about really like how compost works. And if you are going to make it at home, just a couple pointers on it.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So that's my thing. When I think of raised garden beds, I'm thinking you don't get all that natural stuff, like all these bugs and worms and the slide before you that had, the bacteria and stuff. So if you actually buy topsoil and compost and you put it in a raised garden bed, is that the same as if you have it in the ground?
Thank you. That is such a good question. So the compost that you would buy, say at a store like Lowe's, that comes in a plastic bag, usually that compost is heated, and so it doesn't really contain a high amount of the biological matter in a compost. But the compost that you would buy from, say, a landscaping company, or if you live in Ypsi, you can get it for free down at Water Street or from the township. that compost, because it is, it's from the world, it's from outside, it actually comes with all of those amazing bacteria and some of these decomposers as well. So you can kind of think of starting a garden bed with some finished compost as like an inoculant. So it's actually bringing in that bacteria from the larger compost pile where it has grown and flourished, and putting it into your new beds, and then they'll grow and spread that way. So that's one reason we always add compost to new beds. We also add it because of its nutrient content. I don't know if that answered your question.
Sort of, yeah.
One note is that compost is not soil. There's a difference. Remember, soil is made up of all these different things, minerals and biological matter. And so we don't really recommend people to grow purely in compost. Sometimes people will build raised beds or get containers and fill it only with compost. There's a couple of reasons why we don't recommend that. One is because you're gonna get a huge harvest this year. So the first year that you use compost, you're gonna get, a lot of great success. There's a ton of nutrients in that soil. But actually you could have too many nutrients, and having too much nutrients in your soil is also problematic. It leads to things like having infestations of pests and diseases. You can also have too much of certain minerals in your content. Gardens that add a lot of compost every year often have high amounts of zinc in the soil. So compost and soil are not the same thing, but they do work really well together. And so we use a 50-50 mix when we start our garden beds. And then if you're building a garden bed that is open on the bottom so that the roots can go into the soil, it also means that all of these amazing decomposers and bacteria will go into your bed. So there will be a movement between the ground and the bed. Someone asked, can you say more about where we can get free compost in Ypsi? Absolutely. So in Ypsilanti, there's two places to get free compost. So one is at the Waterworks Park. Waterworks Park is across from Ford Lake. A lot of people recognize it because when you go on 94, on one side, you'll see Ford Lake, and on the other side, you'll see a huge empty factory with like those giant parking lots. Right across the street there is Waterworks Park, and that is where the city takes a lot of its yard clippings. So when you put out yard clippings up for the city to pick up, that's where they take it and they dump it and into these giant piles, and it slowly decomposes. It is not a managed compost, so they don't turn it and they don't screen it. Which means you never really know what you're going to get. There is often trash in it, but it is free. I have definitely filled up my car many times from that site. And then the other site is Ypsilanti Township. Each resident is allowed to come and get 2 yards of compost free every year from the township. When you go into their site, they just ask for ID and you can show it to them. And then you can fill up your car or truck. And actually, for folks that use Facebook, on the Ypsilanti Gardeners Discussion Facebook group, I posted a spreadsheet of all of the places to get compost, both those as well as private companies you can order compost from.
I went to the township site last weekend and they said they're not doing it until April 5th.
That makes sense. Yeah, they usually don't open until much closer to our spring frost date, which we're actually about to talk about. The trucks can't really move around too early in the season because usually in Michigan we have pretty wet seasons. So those really big trucks can't really like move around. They kind of sink. So they don't open until later. But April 5th, that is great to know. So how to make compost at home. Perfect. That's what we're actually going to talk about next. So I just wanted to start with this picture of these decomposers. Because, a lot of people think of compost just as like organic matter, leaves and stuff breaking down, but they don't really know why or how. And it's sometimes hard to know because unless you have a microscope, you can't see all of the bacteria. But what we can see when you're looking in your compost is all of these larger, what we call primary decomposers. So these are like the roly-poly bugs and earthworms and snails and flies, all of like the big things that we can see that start eating that organic matter and break it down. After those primary decomposers break stuff down, then it gets to the smaller decomposers, and then down to the bacteria and fungi. And important to note is that composting is actually a biological, but it is also a chemical process. So it's actually what we see on a molecular level is the reorganization of carbon and other nutrients in our soil. So if you want to make compost at home, you need two basic ingredients. You need things that are what we call brown or carbon heavy, and things that are green or nitrogen heavy. And I will tell you a poem taught to me by my father, who worked professionally with compost. And the poem is, 1 part green, 2 parts brown, makes the compost turn to ground. Add some water and some soil, turning is the only toil. So that's my recipe for compost. And basically what it means is you want 1 part of green items. So green items include food scraps, fresh grass clippings. We have here tea bags, hair, coffee grounds, alfalfa meal, weeds, anything that is really fresh. And you can think about the difference between brown and greens. If you think about cutting grass, when you first cut grass, it's nice and green. And it has a lot of nitrogen in it. Nitrogen is a very volatile compound. So over time, the nitrogen will actually go up into the air, and that grass is going to turn like a darker brown color. And then it's heavier in carbon. So you want about 2 parts brown to 1 part green. So the brown is really important. So for most home gardeners, they actually, you may need to bring in a source of brown material. I like to use wood chips or straw. You can use sawdust as long as it comes from untreated wood. Fall leaves is a great one. I know a lot of people, get excited when they start seeing people bagging up their leaves and putting it on the corner in the fall. I definitely have been known to go around my neighborhood and pick up all those bags of leaves and store them for future compost needs. And you will know if you have too many greens in your pile because it won't smell good. It'll start to smell bad. And that's because if there's too many greens in your pile, often it's too wet. And if it's too wet, it is actually going to create a living environment that encourages bacteria that survive well without oxygen. And those bacteria, they produce that smell that kind of smells like poop. So if your compost smells like poop, you want to actually turn it, but you also want to add more brown material. You can put fish, meats, bones, dairies, diseased plants, etc. in a compost, but it's not recommended at a small scale, especially in the city. And that is because you're actually most likely to attract some pests and vermin if you put those things into your soil and they don't get to break down a lot. So like I said, the first part of the recipe is 1 part green and 2 parts brown. And then the next part is that you want to add some water and some soil. So the water, you want your compost to be moist because all those macro and microorganisms need that moisture to survive, but they also need oxygen to survive. And so it's very important that your compost has some moisture in it, but also that you turn it. When you turn your pile, basically what you're doing is you're adding more air into your pile, and you're also creating places where the carbon and the nitrogen meet, and that's where some of the chemical processes really happens at. So one rule of thumb is to add things to your pile, and actually put your hand on your compost pile and you'll feel the heat. Compost will get really hot when it's actually decomposing. And if you can feel the heat, that's great. And when you start to feel that heat go down, that is a sign to turn it again, because when the heat goes down, what it means basically is that those decomposers have kind of finished, the bacteria have kind of done their thing, and that they're either like out of materials to eat or they don't have enough air or water. So you're basically creating this environment for the bacteria and fungus to survive, and to keep that environment nice for them. You do have to do a little bit of management. One thing you can do is layer your compost. So I like to put like a layer of green and then a layer of brown and then a layer of green and then a layer of brown, and that creates that interaction between the two elements. And then it also helps make it a little bit easier to turn. We had a question: can compost outside in the Michigan when it gets frozen outside? Oh, that is such a great question. So one really important thing about composting is first a biological activity. So it's first those large, those roly-poly bugs and ants and things like that are coming and really breaking up the really big chunks of thing. And then it goes down to the fungus and the bacteria. And then they do their thing. And then after they do their thing, when they slow down, then the chemical process is really finishing up. And that end part, that chemical process, is essential to get a compost that doesn't have weed seeds or other plant diseases in it. So what you're looking for is a temperature of about 150 degrees for at least 10 days. If you are really trying to, get your compost going fast, you can use a thermometer. We have just like a big thermometer that we stick in it. We measure the temperature, and when we see it, get up to 150, we're like, yes, sweet, high five. And then we monitor it, and when it dips back down, we'll turn it and then see if it goes up again. And then when after you've turned it for a while, things have settled down. This is usually about like 6 months or 3 months if you're doing it quite often after you're adding things. You should see that your compost doesn't have anything really recognizable in it. So say you put banana peels in your compost, 3 months later, you shouldn't see those banana peels anymore. You shouldn't see like pieces of wood chips, because if you see aggregates like that in your compost, it means that those decomposers and the bacteria and fungus aren't done, right? They haven't basically finished decomposing that. So then when they have finished decomposing that, when you see something that looks more like soil, then there is a resting period for us, but not a resting period for the soil, because what's happening then is there's a chemical process happening where the carbon is actually reorganizing itself into this very orderly kind of like brick-like system if you were to look at it under a microscope. And it's that point when the carbon is like in brick nice layers that your compost is done. And we consider that done because when it's in that form, the compost is very stable. It's something called humus, not the dip. But basically it's a very stable carbon source. And so what it does is it holds on to all that fertility, all of the nutrients from the things you added it, and it holds on to it tightly, right? And that allows it to release those nutrients over many years. If you don't let your compost finish through that chemical process, you're going to have a product that just is not as stable. And so it's going to release those nutrients really fast. And that's what often leads to what's called like burning crops, if it's like way too much nutrients in it, or to infestations. So to get that high of a temperature in compost, you need at least about 3 by 3 feet, right? So we're looking at a pile that's like 3 feet wide, 3 feet long, and 3 feet tall. So it's that amount of quantity of goods that you can get those high temperatures. One thing that often happens if you don't have a pile big enough is that you won't get those high temperatures, and then it will freeze. And when it's frozen, it's not doing anything, right? So that is definitely a sign that your pile is not big enough. Eventually, small piles can decompose, but it will take a lot longer if you don't get that heat going in your compost pile. So while I love some of the spiffy containers that are for sale on the market, most of them are not actually big enough to get a full compost process done in. You really do need that size. Now, I will also say that I am kind of a lazy composter. And so I do the no-turn method often, which means I take a pile of my yard and I throw all the stuff in it in layers, and then I let it sit for like 5 years. And then I have compost. But if it's something you want to use quicker, you do actually have to manage it and turn it. We had one question, can you turn it too often? Let's see. It won't hurt the pile to turn it too often. You'll just be like adding more air and mixing it up more. And that doesn't really harm the plants. Harm the process, but it won't benefit the process either. So you really don't need to turn it until you're seeing either that it's too compact and it doesn't have enough airspace or doesn't have enough water. And both of those things you'll also be able to tell just by the heat of the pile. So if the pile is cold, it means you need to turn it. Or it means that it's not big enough to get to a high enough temperature. Or it means your ratio of brown to green is off. Someone asked, what do you do about the fact that we're like creating green stuff more often every day? That is very true. Every day I weed my garden. Every day I have weeds to throw in the compost pile. What I recommend is just having a pile of brown material wherever your compost pile is. And that way, when I throw in a bunch of green stuff, I just throw on some brown right on top. And that way I keep the balance. If you don't have access to brown material, you can let that green stuff sit. You can also, say it takes you a couple weeks to go pick up some leaves. That's fine. You can just throw your weeds right on top of the compost pile. What you don't want to do is throw food scraps onto your compost pile and just let them sit uncovered. You definitely want to, cover them in some brown material and stuff, because your neighbors aren't going to be happy if you start attracting rodents and it starts to smell bad. Someone brought up vermicomposting. That's composting with worms. That is a great small scale option. You don't need to have the same size of materials for vermicomposting. You can even have like a small shoebox. Basically, you're feeding your pet worms with food scraps is what it is. And then what you are getting back is the worm poop, which is just full of nutrients. You do want to be careful with vermicompost because it is so high in nutrients that if you put it directly on many plants, it will actually cause them harm. So you do want to mix it into the soil a little bit or put it on top more like salt or pepper. And then yes, ChipDrop. ChipDrop is a great app. It's just chipdrop.com. It is an app for cell phones. You put your address on, and arborists, when they're finished with their projects, they often have a ton of wood chips. They either have to pay to go put those in a landfill somewhere, or put them somewhere where people are going to compost them, or they could drop them off at your house for free. I pretty much always have an open chip drop at my house, always collecting wood chips, and at Growing Hope too. You'll probably see if you come into our parking lot, there's pretty much always a giant pile of wood chips there, and that we use for our paths, we use for our compost, and then also if folks need some, it's there for people to come and take. Yes, it is an app. It is called Chip, like wood chip, and then Drop, because they literally come with a truckload of wood chips and then drop them. Yeah, so that is a little overview of compost. like I said, it's a great thing to do at home, and it's not something that you know, don't worry if you're not doing it perfect, because you can just let it sit. Um, you know, really what you just want to keep an eye and a nose out for is if it starts smelling bad, if it's attracting rodents, then you want to do something. But there's people who, you know, interact with their compost every day, take temperature once a week. There's also people like me who throw stuffs in a pile and then 5 years later come and use it. So, you know, it's kind of dependent on your own lifestyle and how much work you want to put in. All right, so that is compost, and just to take a review. So if you were with us during the first class, we've already really talked about some of the real basics for setting up a garden for success, right? So that's like the site, so where you're going to put your garden, how much sun is there, do you have access to water, is it in a place that's convenient for you? Is the design of your garden functional for what you want to use it for? And then also providing those plants with the nutrients that they need, which is managing the soil and the soil health. Does anyone have any other questions about those things before we move on to talk more about plants?
What's the difference between soil and potting mix?
Oh yeah, good question. So potting mix, something you'll see for sale, you know, they sell it at the big box stores or small garden stores. Potting mix is literally a mixture of different materials that works well for taking a small seedling in a container and putting it in a bigger container. So there's two things that you'll normally see for sale. One is called a seed sowing mix, and a seed sowing mix is just like a light, fluffy, organic material. It's often mostly made out of safgun moss or coconut coir, and it's basically like a nice little bed for your seed to grow in, and it doesn't need to have any nutrients at all because seeds carry their own nutrients in them. They have enough nutrients to last it, you know, kind of shelf stable. And then also when you put them into a mix or the soil that has enough nutrients to create those first little leaves that you see, they're actually not technically leaves, they're called cotyledons. And the main difference between a seed sowing mix and potting mix is the nutrients, because in seed sowing you don't need the nutrients. Sometimes there are mixes with nutrients. I use a mix with nutrients in it because it allows you a little bit more time before you have to put it into a bigger container. But a potting mix will contain fertility, so it usually has like manure or compost. It may have some like heavier fertility additives like bone meal or blood meal, things like that. And then it will also have quite a bit of just like our carbon source, like a safgun moss or coconut coir. It's usually about 50-50 between like a topsoil and the coir or safgun moss. So it's a lighter mixture than soil, like it's not as heavy as soil. And it's really designed for like containers. So in your house, you can use it. Or like before you know, between having a little plant in a little pot and putting it in the ground, if you're gonna have some time, you'll wanna put it into a potting mix. Hopefully that answered your question. So it's a commercial product that you can buy. It's also something that you can mix yourself. How often to put compost on existing beds? Oh, this is such a good question. So usually I add compost about once a year, depending on what I'm growing. The crops that are larger often take more nutrients out of the soil. And I like to think about my soil kind of like a bank account. So if you take a lot of nutrients out of your soil, you don't want to end up in a deficit. So you want to add those nutrients back in for the next growing season. So we'll add compost back in after growing things. If we're doing a lot of intensive growing, which we're going to talk about next, I'll add compost more often. Sometimes I'll add it up to three times a year, depending on how many crops I have in there. Larger crops are things like tomatoes or okra or beans or peppers or things like that, compared to like lettuce or spinach that's just physically smaller. The smaller the plant, the less nutrients it's taking from the soil. Now, one very, very important note. So in Michigan, at least when I was a kid, we had very cold winters. We would often have many weeks at a time below zero. And with that temperature, with that low temperature, weed seeds and pests and diseases are killed, right? So we really love that freeze in Michigan. It is part of our agricultural system. However, with climate change, we are having less and less days of freezing temperatures. And because of that, the insects and plant diseases can live and multiply in your garden bed a lot more, right? Because it's just they have more months of the year that they can be multiplying. So with that, the important thing is that compost, right, it's very high in nutrients, and it's also very high in organic matter. And having too much organic matter in your soil is really bad for your plants. And that's because that organic matter, especially if it's not a finished compost, is going to attract those decomposers, right? It's going to attract ants and mealybugs and roly-polies. And those things are great in your compost pile when they're breaking it down. They're not so great when they're in your garden bed, and instead of breaking down compost, they're eating your plant roots. So because of that, when we don't have as cold winters, you want to be a lot more careful about having a finished compost that you put on your garden bed, and also not putting on too much. And I highly recommend doing soil testing, both for the safety of your soil, but also to see what nutrients are in your soil. I do soil testing at Growing Hope on the Farm at least once or twice a year. And then I actually get, the numerical information about how many nutrients are in my soil, and I will add compost accordingly. So it's just a matter of math. Another thing to do is, to look at your soil and see if it looks like your soil doesn't have a lot of organic matter, if it doesn't have that delicious dark chocolate color or that beautiful texture of like a chocolate cake. It could be that you don't have enough organic matter or nutrients in your soil, and so then adding compost would be very helpful for that. But, you can also grow, there's soils that, especially in the South, that are very red in color, because of their different mineral content, and you won't be able to necessarily tell just by looking how much organic matter is in there. So kind of like a rule of thumb, I'll add some compost between plantings, and usually at the beginning of the year I'll work in some new compost. And then if you start to see too many roly-poly bugs or ants or things like that in your soil, that's a sign that you have too much organic matter and you want to slow it down.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I have started doing this, and now I'm questioning maybe I shouldn't be based on what you just said. In the fall, I mulch my leaves instead of like sucking them up into a bag. I have a mulcher on my air blower thing.
Oh,
and
cool.
So I take the bags and I put it right on my garden beds. Is that not a good idea?
Normally, it's so hard to say, because what is normal now? I don't know what's normal weather in Michigan anymore.
Yeah.
But if we have, a couple weeks below zero, that's a wonderful thing to do, because you're protecting your soil from blowing away. You can keep in moisture, right? You're adding organic matter, which is so important to the soil. It can prevent weeds from growing, right? Because it's just like covering the soil. But if you're noticing that you have a lot of like macroinvertebrates in your soil, then you might have too much.
Okay. It was partly just efficiency.
Yeah, totally. I love using leaves as mulch. I actually, well, I go around neighborhoods and collect my neighbors' leaves, and then I run them over with the lawnmower to create mulch. But yeah, if you have something on your leaf blower that shreds them, that's amazing.
Yeah, and then in the spring, I just kind of work it into the soil as I'm planting.
That I wouldn't recommend.
No.
Um, some people also will use wood chips as mulch. So mulch is basically something that you put on top of the soil that keeps the sun from hitting the soil, and that prevents the soil from drying out from evaporation. It also prevents other like weeds from growing because they don't see the sun. It can keep the moisture, the moisture in. So mulch is a great thing to use. People use straw. Don't use hay. Hay has seeds in it. Use straw. They use, shredded leaves are great. People use shredded paper, newspaper, cardboard. Some people use plastic. A lot of farms will use what's called a plastic mulch layer that they plant into. So there's all sorts of different materials that you can use as mulch. And it's a really great thing to do if you don't have too high organic matter in your soil. One example, so at Growing Hope, we have a large hoop house that we plant in, and we used to have wooden beds in that hoop house, and the wooden beds were old and they started to rot. And what happens when you have rotting wood in your soil is all of the roly-poly bugs are like, yay, food, what a wonderful home, thank you. And they like multiply like crazy, and then they eat your roots. So in that situation where I'm like already have too much organic matter or I'm already struggling with the roly-poly bugs, I would not mulch. I would not add more organic matter. But outside is a different story on the farm. In beds that I've replaced the wood recently that's not breaking down, or in areas that I'm just growing straight in the ground, mulch can really be helpful. And sheet mulching, people use that term in a couple different ways. One is what's called like lasagna gardening, where you're literally like making layers of different carbon heavy material and then planting into it, or letting those decompose and then planting into it. Or people also use it like if they're like using paper or something, like you can buy giant rolls of brown paper that you can use, and you punch holes in it and put your plants in there. All right. So now I want to talk about plants.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
If you're adding compost, then do you need to turn the soil, or can you just lightly mix it on top? This is when you have an existing bed and you're growing for the next season.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. That depends. So people add compost in two different ways. So some people use compost itself as a mulch, especially people that do what's called no-till gardening, where you're not like turning the soil or using a rototiller like a machine. So it's like the compost itself is like a mulch. And that's a great thing to do. It does add nutrients to your soil. It can prevent loss of water. But if you're using the compost really to add nutrients, you do need to mix it in. So before you plant, before you put in a seedling or seeds, you want to mix that compost in at least 6 inches into the soil. The main nutrient that we're usually adding with compost is nitrogen. And like I said, nitrogen is actually quite volatile to oxygen. So you'll be able to see if you put like a fresh, beautiful, like a dark black compost on a bed, and you come out like a week later, you'll see that top layer is kind of a lighter color. It has a little bit of a different texture, and that's because the nitrogen has volatilized. So if you're using compost to add nutrients to your soil, you do need to mix it in so that nitrogen stays in your soil.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about plants. I'm sorry, I think I got overexcited talking about soil and compost. I just love it. We'll talk about plants, and then we have 2 more class sessions too. So I also want to let you know that I have a variety of handouts for all of you that I will send either later tonight or tomorrow with more detailed information about some of this stuff. So, and this presentation itself will be available to you. So don't feel like you have to memorize everything or write everything down right now. So planning for seasonal abundance. I love this part of gardening. In the winter, I love nothing more than sitting down with like a ton of garden catalogs and my seeds and like a paper and a pencil or my computer and like planning out a whole schedule for the year. So when I think about like planning a garden, in terms of the plants, I think about like what I want to grow. What do I want to eat the next year? When do I want to eat it? And that's like how much sun do I have where my garden is? How much time do I have to work in the garden? Do I want to be like doing intensive gardening? Do I want to more just like throw things in the soil and see what happens? And then once I've kind of, thought about what makes sense to grow, I then move on to the question of when. When do you grow it? And that is really dependent on temperature, so the soil and air temperature, as well as the day length, the number of hours of sunlight, and also if you're doing any season extension, which we'll talk about in the last class. And then I talk about, okay, well, how am I going to plant those things? How much space do they need? Am I going to do any intensive things like intercropping or succession planting? So these are like the main things to start thinking about if you want to plan out your garden calendar, think about what you want to grow. And on the right, what I have is a picture of an example of square foot gardening. So it's a really great tool to just really easily visualize what you can grow in the space that you have. So the first thing to think about in terms of spacing is how big the plants are going to be when they're fully mature. And if you can like visualize that in your head, you can see the plant itself, you can think about how much space that's actually going to need. And we're going to go into detail in that in a second. So those are that's the overview of what we want to think about. So what does that actually look like? What does that mean? This is the first thing that I love to think about is what is our climate like? So the climate, not the weather, like what is typical in our climate. And very, very importantly, when is the last day we're going to have a frost in the spring? And when is the first day we're going to have a frost in the fall? So we have this lovely map here, and you can see that Michigan, we are like right in between this like light blue and green area. So in the spring, the average last frost is about May 10th, usually in Ypsilanti. So that is a really important date, right? So that is the last day that we think there's going to be a freeze, which means for plants that don't like to be frozen, you want to put them in after that date. There are plants that do fine with a freeze, and those you can put in beforehand. So knowing those dates is very important. And then the same for the fall, right? Because the first time it snows or freezes, there are certain plants like spinach, collards that they're actually going to get better after a freeze. But then there's some plants like tomato where the whole plant will just die because they don't like to be frozen. And so along with like what is our typical first and last frost of the year, we also can think about microclimates. So microclimates are basically like small areas that have a little bit of a different environment than other areas where you're growing. My favorite example of a microclimate, I'm sorry, this picture is not very good. On the right side is actually, that is a picture of a dryer vent. So dryer vents on the side of houses and buildings, hot, moist air comes out of them. And that hot, moist air you can use for plants that like a little bit more heat. My mother, actually, she may be on this call, is really good at using microclimates, and she just has a beautiful flower garden by her dryer vent and also her neighbor's dryer vents, and her flowers there bloom sometimes a month earlier than in other places. So that's kind of an extreme example of a microclimate, but you can also think about walls. My house has a south-facing brick wall, so the sun, hits that brick wall, and those bricks retain that heat and actually slowly give it off. So it's always about 3 degrees warmer close to that side of my house. So I can plant there earlier in the year. I can keep plants there later into the fall. And of course, right, none of that's like on purpose. Some people actually create purposeful microclimates in their growing area. And I have a picture here just like of a wall. You can see that someone put in their garden, and it is giving extra heat and sun on one side next to a lavender plant that really likes the hot and dry weather. And then on the right side of the wall, on the north facing side, it actually creates more shade, and it's a little bit cooler. And that's a great place to put plants that like more shade and cooler weather. So microclimates are awesome, especially growing in an urban environment. We have a ton of microclimates. I actually live on the east side of Detroit, and we have a lot more paved areas. So we're always about 5 degrees warmer than in Ypsilanti, just because of that heat sink from all of the concrete. So the other things about seasonality, other than just frost dates and temperature, is to think about the temperature of the soil. The temperature of the soil is really important, both for seeds to germinate, so that's when seeds open up and they start to grow. And excuse me, a technical thing, I'm just going to, let's see. Excuse me. All right, so I am just switching over here. Hopefully you can see I have something that says here, Appendix 3, Soil Temperature Conditions for Vegetable Seed Germinations. This is one of the handouts I'm gonna send you all. And this is actually just a spreadsheet of the minimum and maximum temperature that seeds of different vegetable plants will grow in. So let's say beets. Beets are a good example. Beets will not germinate in soil temperatures below 40 degrees. And they also won't germinate in soil temperatures above 95 degrees. So that means if I'm going to put my beet seeds in the ground directly, I'm going to start my plants from seed. I have to plant them right in the spring when it's warmer than 40 degrees, and then wait a period of time during the summer, because normally, well, sometimes it's hot in Michigan in the summer, and beet seeds won't germinate in heat. So I plant my beets in the spring and in the fall, but not really in the summer. And then there's also an optimum here. So this is a great chart for putting seeds directly into your garden, but it's also a great thing if you're starting from seedlings. Some people like to grow their own seedlings, or you can buy them from farmers. Our farmers market has a lot of great seedlings available, box stores, nurseries, etc. So we start a lot of stuff from seedlings at Growing Hope. We grow as much as we can from plants instead of seeds, and that's because we're not always very good at weeding right away, and so it's a lot easier to start with a bigger plant. But we actually have heat mats. So when I start the tomatoes, and I usually start our tomatoes inside in about March or February, I have this little heat mat that keeps the soil a little bit warmer than air temperature. And I always tell people, if you don't have a heat mat, you can put your seed tray on top of your fridge. Fridges produce a little bit of heat, and usually it's enough to get some of those seeds to start germinating. So this I'm going to send to you guys. And I find it helpful. I think one thing that's really, really important or a good thing to think about is with these beets, they can't really grow when it's too hot. Or you think about beans, right? Beans above 85 degrees is too hot. And so a common thing that people will come and ask us at Growing Hope is in August, they'll be like, how come my radishes or beans aren't growing? Or why can't I grow any spinach? And that's just because it's simply too hot. You really have to think about the minimum, but also the maximum temperature for things. right, so I am going to switch back. Okay. Oops, sorry about that. So the next thing I want to talk about is these dates. So this is, oops, can you guys see that?
No.
No, okay. Let's try again. All right, can you see it now? It should say vegetable seedling calendar.
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is a cheat sheet. I'll also send it to you guys. And it lets you know basically how tolerant of cold weather the plants are. So it's the earliest that you can start things. So again, we have the beets. So it says the number of weeks to start seeds before setting out. So you can either grow beets from seed, putting the seeds directly in your garden, or you can grow them with a transplant, like a small seedlings. Beets, most people start by seed. So actually, let's talk about broccoli. So, but we do start our beets from seedlings. Most people don't though. But broccoli, right? So broccoli is a cool season crop. It is something that grows really well in Michigan in the spring and the fall. People like to eat it. I love it. And broccoli is pretty hardy plant. It is pretty tolerant of the cold, and you can start it either outside by seed or by plants actually 2 weeks before the frost-free date. So you know, if you're going to start your broccoli by seedling, starting April 21st, you can put it outside normally in Ypsilanti. So, and then if you want to start your own seedlings, you want to start those 4 to 6 weeks before that. So basically, this is a math problem. So we're thinking about the, you know, how tolerant the plants are of the cold weather, both in terms of the air temperature, right? So when you put a seedling outside, it's going to be affected by the temperature of the soil where its roots are, but it's also going to be affected by the temperature where its leaves are. And broccoli can take a small freeze, but it can't take a very hard freeze. Now cabbage, cabbage is like a workhorse. There's cabbage that can like grow all winter long in Michigan, even under the snow. Well, they're not growing, but they're just living. So 4 weeks before the last frost date in the spring. So I will start putting out cabbage almost next week or the week after. And you know, if it drops down to 30 at night, I'm not worried. That cabbage is going to do absolutely fine. It's going to keep growing. I start my cabbage usually from seedlings. And so I want to start my seedlings 4 to 6 weeks before that frost date, before I'm going to put it outside. So this is just a little cheat sheet of when we start things, both for seedlings and by seed in Ypsilanti. And then also I am including in this our flower calendar. I love growing cut flowers. I love beauty. I think beauty and joy are super important. So I like to grow a lot of flowers, and so this will show you when you can put them out. Let's see, something that it's pretty common, calendula. Calendula is also called pot marigold. Usually has yellow or orange flowers. It's a medicinal plant. It helps rebuild skin tissue. It is edible. Tastes kind of like honey. They're beautiful. I like them all over my garden, and I will start the seeds about 6 to 8 weeks ahead of time. So usually mid-March. So I already have started my calendula seed, and then I put them out after or like on that frost-free date. Calendula can take a little bit of a freeze, and actually this winter it wasn't so cold, and so some of my calendula actually made it through the winter, and it's still growing. Yes, so this is just a little calendar. I'm sorry I'm talking a little bit fast. I just wanted to show you guys this. What questions do you guys have so far about this? Oh, someone says, do I have an Instagram? I do. It is at Farmer Bees. So farmer and then BEES. And yes, let's talk about spacing. Yes, yes, yes. All right, let's see. All right, so talked about the seasonality of the plants, just a little bit more on the seasonality, and then we'll talk about spacing next. So when you're thinking about, you have that chart that I sent you guys, but there's also some general rule of thumb to figure out if plants like the heat or the cold and when you should start them in your garden. And the first thing I always tell people to think about is what part of the plant are you going to eat? Most greens, so like lettuce, kale, spinach, chard, things where you're eating the leaf of the plant, are considered cold weather crops, and you can start them earlier. And that's just literally because the plant doesn't need as long to grow and mature, because you're eating the leaves, you're not eating the fruit. Where hot crops, things like peppers, tomatoes, eggplant, things like that, you're eating the fruit of the plant, and so those take a much longer season to grow, and so they're considered like a hot crop. So that's like the part of the plant, the size of the plant. Oh, origin is spelled wrong, but the origin of the plant. A lot of hot crops, tomatoes and peppers, right, are from South America. They're from warmer climates. Peppers, in parts of South America, peppers are perennial. They will grow year to year to year and basically turn into like trees, which is amazing. We actually have some hot peppers we've been overwintering inside our office, who they have fruit on them. Fruit, again, it's amazing. I'm not really sure how that happened, but it did. And then also, right, seasonality is not just about the temperature in your climate, it's also when you want to eat it. Okay. All right, so this is what I was saying before. It's just math. So if you want to create a calendar, so if you want to go beyond just when do I need to put the seeds in the ground, but you want to think about like your whole season, again, it's really just math. And the things that you want to know are the germ temperature, so the temperature at which those seeds will germinate, and then how long it takes to germinate things, right? So some things like peas or beans will germinate in like 1 day. So you put them in the soil, you water it, they soak up that soil, and then like within a couple days, if it's warm enough, you'll see like, oh, it has a root, oh, it has cotyledons, and then it had leaves. They'll like grow very fast. Where other things like carrots, oh my gosh, carrots can take up to 21 days to germinate. And that's very important because I have planted carrot seeds in my garden, and then like a week later, I see nothing, and I'm like, oh, I guess I didn't plant anything here, and then I'll replant. So it's important to know how long it takes to germinate, so you know where things are, and how long that take. And then if you're growing them in seedlings, how long it takes to grow in those trays. So in that spreadsheet, that thing where it said like 6 to 8 weeks, that means the seedlings are actually in the tray itself for 6 to 8 weeks. And then hardening off. Hardening off is a process where you take your baby seedling from your house or the greenhouse, wherever you bought it from, and you slowly acclimatize it to the temperature outside. You don't want to take a tomato plant that's been grown in your house for 2 months and just like put it outside in May in Michigan, because it's going to be cold. You got to like slowly do it. So sometimes people will like put their plants outside for a couple hours and then take them in. And then the next day for like 4 hours and then bring them in. And then the next day like 6 hours and bring them in. So it's a very important process to not like shock your plants. If you're buying plants from a nursery, or if you're getting them from Growing Hope, we'll have hardened them off already for you, so you don't have to worry about that. But if you're growing your own seedlings, it's something to keep an eye on. And then that planting date, right? So when you can put it in the ground, right? Cabbage, you can put in the ground and it can freeze. It's totally fine. Basil, you cannot put it in the ground and it's going to freeze because it'll turn to mush. And then, like, if you're really thinking about your calendar, you're going to think about something called the days to maturity. And that's basically just the number of days the plant is going to be in the ground before it's ready to harvest. So things like spinach, lettuce, things that are small, they have shorter days to maturity, right? Because the plants themselves don't actually need to grow as much because you eat them when they're small. Spinach, you know, in about May, in Michigan, you can get spinach in 3 weeks. You put the seeds in the ground, and 3 weeks later, you're harvesting. Okra, you know, has a very long time before it matures, and that's because the plants themselves have to grow fairly large before they start fruiting. Or tomatoes and carrots. Carrots have like 100 days to maturity, so you're, you know, thinking about like, well, when do I want to eat carrots? And then you have to do a little math in your head and think, okay, well, you have to count back. Okay, well, what's 100 days before I want to eat it? That's when you want to put the seeds in the ground. And then some plants you harvest multiple times. Some plants you just harvest once. And then also the plants that you can harvest multiple times, there's a window between the harvests where you want them to regrow. So, you know, you can just buy, you can go and buy seedlings. You can get them from Growing Hope starting May 1st. You can take them and put them in the ground and just, you know, harvest them when they're ready. You can also sit home if you're like me in the winter and do a ton of math and like plan everything out ahead of time, you know, and then of course something happens in the spring and everything's thrown off, but it's still fun. So, and if you're growing on a commercial level, you do have to do all this math because you have to think about bringing in enough money to pay yourself. So, okay, that was a whirlwind of seasonality. I actually, before we talk about, I'm going to talk about companion planting for a second and show you guys the other handouts. And I can stay on a little bit later tonight as well. But I just want to take a second and ask what questions you have about seasonality. A question about that handout. Yes, I do have that handout and I will send it to you guys either tonight or tomorrow morning.
I saw a couple people asked about growing bags. Do you have any opinion on that?
Growing bags. So growing bags are, it's basically like growing in a container, but instead of a pot, it's a bag. So that is fine. The most important thing when thinking about growing in a small space like a container or a bag is how big that plant is going to get. And how much space it needs for its roots. So the rule of thumb is that plants' roots usually are about as deep as the plant is tall and as wide as the plant is wide. So it kind of mirrors each other. So you want to make sure that that bag is big enough for the plant that you're going to grow. So if you're growing tomatoes, you need a much bigger bag than if you're growing spinach. Some people do grow large plants like tomatoes, eggplants, peppers in grow bags if you're adding additional nutrients throughout the season. But grow bags are just fine. You know, it doesn't really matter what the container is made out of, as long as it's not something toxic that's going to get into your soil and be dangerous. So, yeah.
Are there other types of conditions we should expose our indoor plants to? Like I'm growing mine in like a grow tray, but they seem to be kind of like falling over a bit. Like they have those two little leaves you were talking about. I forget the name, but they seem to be kind of like flopping over. So I don't know, should I like put a fan on them to make them hardier or?
Do you have lights on them?
Yeah, I was putting a grow light on them.
Okay. How far is the grow light from the top of the leaves?
It was probably about a foot.
A foot. Okay. Well, you could lower them a little bit. I think what you're describing is what we call sometimes being leggy, that the stem itself grows tall, but is pretty thin and they kind of fall over. That's usually a sign that the light is too far away from the leaves themselves.
Oh, okay.
So we usually put our lights about 2 to 3 inches above the leaf, and then as the plant grows, we move the lights or we move the plants down.
Okay. So if they're already flopped over, if I move the light closer, will that help it?
That will help it. And then the other thing that I suggest is actually putting a fan on your plants. So just like a small fan that oscillates around, and the fan, or like if they were outside, it would be the wind actually hitting the outside of the plant. It's actually going to make those plant cells kind of tougher on the outside, and so they'll stand up taller. So a fan is a good thing to do, and then also, yeah, moving the lights.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Other questions about seasonality? Oh, okay. We have a question. Can we mix flowers and vegetables in the same bed? Absolutely. And actually, that is the next thing I will talk about. I think that what we'll do is we'll just go over time a little bit. And for folks who need to go, thank you for coming. And we'll just maybe go for another 10 minutes so I can talk about companion planting. Before I do that, does anyone else have questions about seasonality, temperature, things like that? All right, well, I'll talk about companion planting just for a second then. So companion planting is basically planting plants together that either benefit each other or use the space more intensely. One companion planting that folks are generally familiar with is the Three Sisters Garden. The Three Sisters Garden is a way of growing corn, beans, and squash together. So you're both getting more produce out of a smaller space, and you're also actually helping the plants to grow. The plants help the other plants to grow. So the corn, right, grows up nice and tall, and the beans need something to grow on. So when you grow pole beans, you have to put them on a trellis, something for them to grow up. But you can use corn as a trellis, so it's great for that. Corn also, it's a huge plant, right? And it's producing a lot of food, like as far as like poundage per square foot of ground. And so corn takes a lot of nutrients out of the ground. It especially needs a lot of nitrogen. And beans are amazing. And they, the roots of the beans create these amazing little homes for bacteria in the soil. And that bacteria actually can take nitrogen that's from the air that then goes into the soil, and the bacteria turns it into a form that the plant can eat. So growing beans actually brings fertility into your soil if it needs it. And so growing the beans along with the corn provides the physical structure for the beans to grow on, and then the beans provide nutrients for the corn to grow. And then the squash grows along the ground. It's a vine crop. And so it can grow actually between the rows of corn. So this is really a way to maximize your space and also help the other plants grow. So that's like one example of companion planting. Another common thing is peas and carrots. Peas are also vining crops. They need a structure or something that they can grow up on. They have those beautiful little curly tendrils. So I like to grow my peas in the middle of a bed, and then I actually grow carrots on the outside. Now carrots, of course, we eat the roots of. So this is a way of using all of your vertical space. So it's not so much that the plants add nutrients for each other or providing structure for each other, but we're just using both more space vertically above the ground and then vertically below the ground. Now there's other companion planting that help each other because of reducing pest. And one of my favorite companion plantings for pest reduction is strawberries and alyssum. Strawberries are what you see in this pot. It has that little pink delicate flower that kind of looks like an apple blossom. Uh-oh, my slides aren't moving. Do you guys see a pot with some strawberries?
No.
Okay, let's try again. Let's stop this. All right. Then let's try again. Is it working now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Great. Thank you for letting me know that. So what you'll see here, this is just a pot. So, you know, someone has it. You can see it's on wood chips, so it's probably in their garden. And strawberries. Oh, I love growing strawberries. So fun, especially if you're growing and gardening with kids around, or people that just like sweet things like me. And strawberries are also very, very tasty to many other insects. And flowers are amazing at attracting insects, right? That's kind of what their purpose is to attract insects for pollination. And so alyssum attracts tiny little insects. Alyssum is tiny flowers. There's like white, blue, and purple varieties that are most common. There's pink as well. It's a very common thing that's like sold at garden supply stores. It's a very short plant. It really only grows about 8 inches tall. And because it has these tiny little flowers, it attracts tiny little pollinators, especially something called sylphid flies. And those flies will both pollinate. They'll go and they'll land on those little alyssum flowers, and they will also actually eat other insects that eat the strawberries. So the alyssum flower is bringing in an insect that's going to actually prevent the strawberries from getting insect damage. So they're like wonderful, you know, friends to plant together. You can plant them in the same pot. You can plant them in, you know, the same garden bed with each other. I think they also look very beautiful together. And on the left here, I just have, you know, a picture of some of the more common companion plants. So with beets, beets are great to grow with broccoli, Swiss chard, cabbage, Brussels sprouts. Tomatoes are a big thing. People will grow onions, cabbage, carrots. I like to grow basil and marigolds next to my tomatoes. The marigolds I love the smell of marigolds. They have a very strong scent, and they will actually keep away some insects from the tomatoes. And also in the soil. So they have that same kind of smell in the soil, and those actually keep away something called nematodes. There's good nematodes and bad nematodes, and the marigolds are really helpful in keeping away the bad nematodes. So that's just an example, and I have a handout as well that I'm going to give you guys that just has a list of some of the common companions that I like to use, as well as a description of different ways to use companion planting. So companion planting is great, right, for maximizing the use of space, vertical space, providing support for other plants. But another companion planting that I really like is actually more specifically called intercropping. And intercropping is when you grow plants together in the same bed that have some beneficial effect on each other, or they come at different times. So on the right here, what I have is a picture of radishes and carrots. This is like my favorite intercropping. I pretty much always grow radishes with my carrots. Radishes are super fast to grow. Usually they're ready in about 21 to 28 days from the time you put the seed in the ground. So you can see on the right, those big leaves, those are radishes, and they're probably, I don't know, a couple weeks or a week, depending on the climate and the fertility. And then what you see in between is those tiny little carrots. So carrots are super slow to germinate, which one means that they're easy to forget that you put them in the ground. And so having like the next day radish cotyledons pop up, and then within a week having these beautiful rows of radishes, it shows me where I put my carrots, so I know not to disturb the soil. But also they're perfect as far as timing. So, you know, radishes about 21, 28 days after you put the seeds in the ground, those radishes are ready to pick. And that is like perfectly the size of the carrots where they're going to need more room. So you're using, you know, one space to grow two different plants, and you're growing them what's called like a relay intercropping. So by the time those carrots are big enough that they need more space to grow, those radishes are ready to harvest. You pull them out, and then the carrots have more spacing. So that's an example of intercropping that I really like, and you can do it in all sorts of different configurations: strip intercropping, inter-row cropping, mixed cropping, lots of different ways to do it. But I think it's like really fun. It's a really fun way to garden, and also really helpful. And then some other examples of intercropping that I really like for Michigan is growing lettuce and collard greens. So collard greens are super, super hardy plants. They can grow in the heat, they can grow in the cold, they can take a freeze. They actually taste better after they freeze. So they're sturdy plants. They're plants that you can harvest continuously. So I keep them in the ground for about 20 weeks and harvest them every week or so. And also they're plants that can grow fairly large. And so I like to put my lettuce in between the collard greens, because lettuce is a very sensitive plant. It likes the cold weather, but really doesn't like the heat. If it gets too hot, it's gonna send a signal to that plant. It's gonna switch its hormones over from growing leaves to growing flowers, and then you're gonna get a bulbting. So it's gonna like create a flower stem. It's gonna really change the taste of that lettuce, and basically you won't be able to keep harvesting greens because instead you'll have flowers. So the collard greens and lettuce are great because similar to the carrots and the radishes, they really complement each other's growing needs. And so the collard greens can actually provide some shade and create this microclimate for the lettuce. So it actually creates just like a little bit of a shade for the lettuce. And then if you're like really looking to create microclimates, okra is amazing. So on the left, that is okra plants. I'm sorry, it's a little hard to see, but okra, they grow. They grow about 8 feet, 9 feet tall. They have very thick stems. They have a lot of leaves. They are like trees, basically. They're like mini trees. And if you have a bed of okra, it's like you have a forest. And that can really create a nice microclimate for growing lettuce or spinach or other things that can't really take the heat. So they'll grow a little bit slower because they won't have as much sun, but that's just fine for things like lettuce and spinach that don't need that much sun to grow. I will say the only downfall of planting things between your row of okra is that okra has tiny little root hairs that does bother some people's skin. So I always wear long sleeves when I'm working with okra. But I think that's another fun intercropping, especially, in the late fall. I'll usually start some spinach under there. Usually by late fall or I'm sorry, early fall, people are, ready for spinach again. But it's still too hot in Michigan for that spinach to germinate outside. So I'll put those seeds right in the ground between the okra, and it'll be nice and cool and germinate, and they'll grow there. Let's see. Okay, so that is it for for intercropping. And I think that what we'll do is actually pause there, and we'll continue next week. I will talk about the succession planting and square foot gardening, the spacing needs of plants a little bit more. And we'll also talk about some other stuff, irrigation, needs of plants. But I'll still send you guys all those handouts. And I do want to leave some time for questions. I'm sorry we went over a little bit, but I am happy to stay and answer questions. I hope that this was informative for you guys. I hope the virtual setup works okay. I know it's not as fun as having an in-person workshop where you're actually touching the plants, but I will let you know that our first in-person workshop at our farm is April 10th. So it's the second Saturday of every month. Starting in April, we'll have hands-on workshops right at the farm, and actually I will be teaching that one, and it will be on seed starting and spacing, and everyone will get to take home some seeds and some containers of soil as well for growing your own seedlings. So that's coming up April 10th. There are many volunteer opportunities on our website if you are interested in coming to the farm or helping with the farmers market. There's lots going on right now. We are just starting our home vegetable garden program, and so you can volunteer to help build gardens at people's homes. You can sign up to volunteer at the farm, or like I said, at our farmers market, we have volunteer opportunities as well. So that's about it for me, but I would love to answer any questions that folks have.
There's some in the chat.
Oh, thank you. Let's see, could you do kale instead of collards with lettuce? Yep, kale has the same growing habits as collard greens. They kind of grow up from the central stem and then kind of grow out in a rose pattern on the outside. Some kale is more vertical than it is horizontal. Specifically dino kale, which is also called lacinato kale. It's like the skinnier, darker green kale, where Siberian kale or some of the curly kale is a wider plant. So I would suggest those varieties for lettuce in the heat. And someone said, could I do collards and arugula? Yes, oh my gosh, yes, absolutely. I think you guys got it. I think you guys know what's up. Definitely. Arugula is a great thing to grow in the shade of another plant. Arugula really doesn't like the heat, and the hotter it is, the spicier the arugula will be actually. So for folks that don't really like too spicy arugula, planting it underneath another plant is a really great option. And then will I be sending the recording? I will. I will include the recording with an email with the handouts, and I will also include the recording from our first session. And then I'm just going to skip back to other places for gardening support. We have a Facebook page that we manage called the Ypsilanti Gardeners Discussion Group. Anyone can join that. It's a great place to ask questions. You can show pictures of your plant, ask what's wrong, offer resources. We post handouts there, and usually staff at Growing Hope will go through that and answer questions, as well as getting responses from amazing other knowledgeable gardeners in our community. There's another Facebook group called the Ypsilanti Plant Exchange, and that is set up for people to trade mostly houseplants, but it's super fun. And then of course there's many online workshops, including this series with Growing Hope. YouTube is full of amazing gardening videos. Then of course we have the Growing Hope staff. So if you come by our farm, coming to volunteer days is a great way to pick our brains. You know, usually during volunteer days, we like to talk about different things and listen to music, but I also will answer questions. And then garden mentors. So for folks in our programs, we do offer garden mentors paired up with newer gardeners. So if you are a newer gardener and need a mentor, on those Facebook groups is a great place to ask, or join our programs and we can pair you up. And if you're a more experienced gardener and would be interested in mentoring some new gardeners, you can sign up actually through our website or send me an email. It's my name. It's BEEB@growinghope.net is my email. And then just to let you all know also about some free resources, starting May 1st at Growing Hope, we will have seedlings, seeds, compost containers, and then we'll have produce and flowers out on our free community cart as soon as they are ready. So thank you guys so much for attending. We had one other question. Which plant is a one-time harvest and which are multi-harvest? Is there a handout? Oh, thank you. That's a good question. So one-time harvest plants are things like beets or radishes or carrots, where you're actually eating the root of the plant. So, you know, if you pull a beet out of the ground and you eat the root, it won't keep growing because it's not in the ground anymore. Things like collard greens, you're eating the leaves, so you're pulling the leaves off the outside of the plant, usually starting with the oldest leaves first. And those you can keep in. I keep mine in 20 weeks sometimes. So I'll keep a collard in most of the season. I do 3 plantings of collards a year, and that provides us with collard greens year round, pretty much. And then things that are fruit plants, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, things like that. Those are also multi-harvest. Also many flowers are multi-harvest, zinnias. They're called cut and come again. So if you cut off the flower, they'll grow new ones. And I don't have a handout for that, but I'm going to put that on the list of ideas for handouts because that might be something people are interested in. All right. Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you guys so much for attending. I hope you got something out of it. And same time, same place next week. We'll take it from here. So thank you. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
That was great, Bea.